some neglected aspects of chartership. The PowerPoints I'm using will be available for download afterwards. Some will contain detailed information that I won't be dwelling on today, so it'll be up to you to peruse it at your leisure later. There will be many times I'll be reading directly from the PowerPoint slides text. Two reasons. One is to keep me on topic without a time overrun, and secondly, to audibly reinforce the points being made visually. So it's eyes down, look in. For your information, as well as being a Chartership Scrutineer for CGeol, I'm also a Chartership Assessor for Chartered Engineer and an Assessor for RoadJep. Chartership. What is it actually about? I'll tell you what it's not about. It's not just another technical qualification that adorns the academic geoscience stuff. Chartership as a stamp of peer approval that marks you as a professional who ranks in the same tier as a GP, surgeon, architect, lawyers, surveyors, the whole caboodle. And it's not to be treated lightly. So this term professional, so we're all on the same song sheet. A professional person is a member of a group who, amongst other things, belongs to a learned institution that validates its members' vocational competence, is accepted as possessing special knowledge and skills, and applies this knowledge and exercises these skills within a framework of law, regulation, technical standards, management, budgetary constraints, best practice, or the beneficial effect. And, drum roll please, strictly adheres to health and safety standards and the codes of conduct of the institution. And you may note that these two aspects are infused throughout the chartership criteria. So how is it achieved? Simples. By demonstrating competence with all the 7 chartership criteria. You don't have to demonstrate Einsteinian brilliance, just competence. Ooh. Firstly, it's vital to understand the requirements of all 7 of the criteria and to satisfy each and every one of them. Not just the first 2, the techie stuff, and then treating the remaining 5 as bubblegum and candy floss on a stick. Satisfying the 7 chartership criteria is not just a geo-sky technical exercise. Becoming professionally competent is more than technical training and knowledge alone. So let's just reflect on these 5 equally important chartership criteria to the first 2. Firstly, or rather thirdly, effective communication. Competence in the management of health and safety and environmental matters and statutory obligations. Clear understanding of professionalism and the codes of conduct. Commitment to CPD. Now listen, there can't be a single person amongst you that would be perfectly happy to see a GP or a surgeon or a lawyer or an accountant who are 5 or 10 years out of date. I mean, you just wouldn't. So it's a matter of doing to others what you would have people do to you, keeping up to date. But it's not just keeping the rust at bay, it's also expand your horizons of competence, onward and upwards. And finally, to display competence in your particular area of expertise. Could be hydrogeology, mineral exploration, engineering geology, mapping, ground investigation, whatever. So this practical application of knowledge has to be done within a framework of law, regulation, codes of conduct, current technical standards. Let me tell you, if I receive a submission that doesn't comply with the current standards, current British standards, the Eurocode 7, it goes straight back to where it came from. Because to me, it's driving through a red on a driving test. It's an instant referral. There's best practice, mitigating liability, financial management, and people management. And it's not just managing staff, contractors, colleagues, it's also managing clients. Never let a client manage you. You manage them. Otherwise, you'll get stuffed. All this is to be done for beneficial effect. But look, all the above make an excellent aid to CPD planning. And they do. These aspects are crucial, they're obligatory, and a candidate must demonstrate their competence, not brilliance, in all 7 chartership criteria. Competence. So what is it? GSL training guide, Appendix A table. It gives the steps to competence and defines it. Start with appreciation, grows to knowledge, encompassed by experience, leads to competence, which is this robust knowledge and experience of a subject or activity actually that you undertake without supervision. And you can also successfully direct others in that activity. Competence. Health and safety. It's not an add-on accessory to professional activities. It runs through everything we do, like the name of Blackpool through the stick of Seaside Rock. And there's the rock. Health and safety executive. Health and safety, health and safety. A frequent failure at interview is to recall basics, like who the HSE are, what it does, where the regulations come from, what's expected of a professional, how to avoid loss of liberty. Health and safety executive know this well. It's a quango, and they are responsible for encouraging, regulating, and enforcing health, safety, and welfare in the workplace. The workplace. And remember that the primary legislation behind all this is the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. And it is an enabling act. So everything comes under it in the same way as environmental legislation goes under the Environmental Protection Act. So you get 6-pack regs, for example, all come under the Health and Safety at Work Act. And there are squillions more. And there's even more. I've highlighted some in red, which some of us may be familiar with. But I wonder, what about these 3 here? How many of you realise for the last 25 years there have been specific health and safety regulations relating to borehole sites and operations on them? And that if you stand on the edge of a trial pit, the work at height regulations apply. Because if you fall 2 meters into the bottom of the trial pit, it's just the same as falling 2 meters off the top of a scaffold. And when you fall into the bottom of the trial pit, ladies and gentlemen, you are then subject to the confined spaces regulations. Look, it's impossible to know all or even most of these health and safety regs. And it's just a matter of focusing on those regs that apply in your area of work or you're engaged in. You just need to demonstrate a working knowledge and how you've applied it to keep you and others safe and free from harm. It's just like being on a driving test, where you will be required to give answers to questions on the Highway Traffic Act, traffic law, which you've got from the Highway Code. But you're doing it purely to have a working knowledge, not to be an expert at it. Now, whether you're at the top of the tree as a CEO or the bottom of it, the person on a shovel, everybody is responsible for this health and safety of themselves and others. But listen, responsibility equals liability. And there are two elements to health and safety liability. The first is the harm done to whether it's property or people. The second is breaching the regulations, an offence against the state. Breach of the regs is a criminal offence. And the consequences of the breach of the regs can be more severe than from the harm actually caused. Hazards and risks, critical factors here. Don't confuse hazard and risk, and know exactly what each term means and be able to explain them. Health and safety executive definitions: hazard, anything that may cause harm. This is a critical one. Health and safety executive's definition of risk, where risk is the chance of harm being caused by a hazard, together with an indication of how serious the harm could be. A double-sided coin. Probability of harm occurring, magnitude of the consequences of the harm. Two elements, inseparable. But this HSE definition of risk is also shared by other organisations. European Commission, European Agency for Safety and Work, Health and Safety at Work, Royal Society. But the definition of risk from the Health and Safety Executive also applies to the wider environment. Contaminated land assessment, geotechnical risks, ground abnormals. And it comes under what DEFRA have produced in their guidelines for risk assessment, the Green Leaves 3. But warning, there is another definition of risk, which occurs in medicine, commerce, security, and the Oxford Dictionary. It is merely the chance of harm being caused, and the magnitude of the consequences are not considered, i.e., risk is just the probability of harm occurring. So take heed that in the workplace and the environment, whether it's geotechnics, engineering, geology, geoscience, environmental, the HSE definition of risk applies. Probability of harm occurring, magnitude of consequences of the harm. Now, hey, get this. CSCS cards. Most of us, if not all of us here, have got one of these, and to get one you need to go and have a test, health and safety test, get so many of the 50 questions right. But the study material to prepare you for that test comes from the CITB. And there's either one for managers and professionals, or there's a booklet for operators and specialists. So you get 500 questions from which the 50 are taken. But look at this. Question 110. Don't forget, all this is all within the context of a working environment, the CSCS card. The context of a risk assessment. What does the term risk mean? And the answer given is C. The chance that a hazard could actually cause harm or damage. The answer, that is the definition in the workplace, it's out of sync with that of the HSE, despite the HSE being a consultee to the CITB. It is palpably incorrect. Thank you, Worship. I rest my case. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, David. Thanks for that. Curious that there's a slightly different definitions of, or significantly different definitions of risk out there. but I think we know which one applies to us in the engineering world anyway. Rather than, I don't know if we've got any, no, we haven't got any questions anywhere at the moment, so we'll just move on to Lauren, and I'll hand over to her now.
Okay, well, thank you to David for that talk. I'm going to give a slightly different take from my background of acting as a sponsor and a scrutineer. I have to probably put in the usual disclaimer that these are my personal observations from being asked to be a sponsor, and also from reading sponsor statements as a scrutineer. I probably also should say that while it was a long time since I have been chartered, I do have a bit of a personal knowledge about this, as my husband has recently just submitted his chartership application. So I have, at a very personal level, been being a guide to him. So I'm aware of perhaps the process that people are going through, the different stages, and the questions that are coming out from that. So, see if my screen will now change. Okay, so hopefully now I've got my second slide. So first of all, focusing on you and your sponsors. Your sponsors have a responsibility not only to you, but to themselves. They are, in effect, the last line of defence between you and your interview and your scrutineers. They are not only saying that you are a geologist of the required calibre to join the Geological Society, but they are putting their name on the line too by putting you forward. So asking somebody to be a sponsor for you is actually not only a big thing for you, it's a big thing for them. Choose your sponsors wisely. Your sponsors have to read your application, and not only do they have to read your application, they obviously, each sponsor has to write their own sponsorship application. So we all have people that we work with who could probably act as our sponsors, but some might be more appropriate than others. Think about how the people you work with, what their written styles are. Everyone has a different style of writing. Don't just pick your sponsor because they happen to be your boss. Your sponsor's duties to you are to say that you meet the criteria of the Geological Society and to be truthful about it. Your boss may be excellent technically, but they may also be a person of few words. I've read some very poorly written sponsor statements that made me question whether the person had truly read everything that had been written in the application, and also whether they had provided an accurate reflection of what that person did. Choose somebody who is going to give you a fair response to your application. While you might have a mentor as well, some people will, some people won't. Your sponsor, ask them to give you feedback on where they think your application could be improved. It's a balance of getting the right balance, for want of a better word, really, between them giving you guidance and also them saying that you are the right person for the Geological Society. Timing is another critical part of this, which sometimes in your rush to finish your application can be forgotten. At the start of doing your application, some people might go through this really quickly, start their application, and 2 weeks later they've managed to finish it. For other people, balancing out with a job can mean that the actual application process takes a bit longer. Give your sponsor plenty of notice that you're going to ask them to be your sponsor, because that's the key thing. You want to ask them to be your sponsor. They don't have a requirement to be that sponsor for you. Let them know when you're planning to submit your application. Let them know when the professional statements and things are coming to them, because they have to write their sponsor's statement, and that statement is probably going to take them as much time as it took you to write your professional statement, if not actually slightly longer, because you know you better than they know you. They also have to read all your application documents to understand what it is that you are saying. That is a requirement as a sponsor. So it's not a short thing. Giving them something on a Friday night and telling them they want to have it submitted on a Monday morning probably isn't going to make you any friends. So give them notice, ask them in plenty of time. If your timescales shift because everybody can get caught up in something else, life happens and you might not make the August deadline, you might be now working towards a November one, reconfirm the deadline with them and make sure you help them out as much as possible. It might be worth asking them to have a meeting beforehand and sort of explain what you've put in, how it's structured, how you're working. They're going to get hit by a large document and you want to make it as easy as possible for them to understand what they're seeing, to allow them to write their sponsor's statement that paints you in the best picture they can for the scrutineer who's coming to read it. Ask them if you think you will get chartered based on your application documents. You would like to think that any sponsor who doesn't come back to you and say, I don't think that's going to get you through chartership, or I think you need to improve in certain areas, they would do it without you asking. But sometimes actually physically phrasing the question to them and saying, is my application good enough, might just focus their mind a bit to look into a bit more detail of some of the other competencies that David has just discussed, or even a case of flagging it up to you to say, there isn't actually that much in there about that. So just be aware that when you get to your interview stage, you might get a few questions about that. You might want to go and revise it. Moving on to the role of a scrutineer. So how to make your scrutineer love you. First impressions do count. You've got approximately 6 documents to send to them, plus a personal statement. They're going to get a couple of sponsor statements as well, and they're all going to get all your CPD. Try and make it as easy as possible for them to follow what's going on. You might be submitting one document for your first professional document, but it might have 3, 4, 5, 6 appendices. Don't submit them in all different PDFs and make them go through them all of which are numbered differently. They don't want to get 70 PDFs to wade through that are labelled incongruously that they can't work out which ones go with which. Label everything clearly, consolidate them as much as possible, and add a cover sheet that might be useful at the front of each document that says, this is a specific area that this document is trying to prove. Highlight any areas that are missing. You might have written a report for a quarry for whatever reason that might have had an ecology chapter put into it to go with hydrogeology. You maybe didn't do the hydrogeology chapter, so you've stripped it out. Well, make sure you flag to them that that has been stripped out of the document, because everybody's been in the situation where they've read a document, flipped over the page and gone, why have I jumped from section 3 to section 5? And it might take somebody a while to go back to have a look at the pages at the start to say, oh, look, okay, so section 4 was actually ecology, and they're not going to be chartered ecologists. So that's why they've taken it out. But if you just flag it to them at the start, it's going to make for a more pleasant read for your scrutineer. Cross-reference as much as possible. Your scrutineer is trained to be a scrutineer. They're trained to understand the different chartership competencies for the GSL. But make it easy for them to understand which competencies you are flagging in which document. Read your application, read your personal statement, read all the sections you've written about competency. Make sure everything is cross-referencing through to the different documents you're sending, and the cover sheet of that document is cross-referencing back. Look at your application as a whole and make sure it holds together. By doing this, it will become very obvious to you where perhaps you've got gaps or weaknesses in your application. It's not necessarily something that you need to do anything with your application. It can be very, very difficult, depending on which area you're working in, to show your effectiveness at oral communication and actually provide evidence of that. You know that's what your interview is for, but doing that cross-reference, doing that check is going to help you spot what questions your scrutineer might be coming up with. Don't overwhelm your scrutineer. Now, I know you've got a page limit, a document limit and things like that. Ask yourself, if you've done a risk assessment and you've run the model 16 different times for 3 different sources and things like that, do they really need to see all those models? Or would one appendix be enough that just showed that you could actually run that piece of software? Similarly, if you've got X number of different contour maps, do they really need to see all those contour maps? Is it actually going to help them understand the interpretation and the point that you're trying to make? Would one suffice? They're looking to see whether you're competent and whether you can interpret. They don't need to see that you can do it 74 different times with the same set of data. Consider which site you are using for your document. You may have the greatest piece of work ever, but it might be for a Ministry of Defence site. It might be for a nationally significant site that you are going to spend so long making everything confidential, redacting information, removing drawings, taking out geological cross sections, deleting names, removing the location maps and the outline plan, that you have to ask whether there's anything actually left in your document at the end of the day to show that your work is the greatest that you can do. Is there a piece of work that maybe isn't as technically brilliant, but is going to be an easier story for your scrutineer to follow? And as always, it's quality, not quantity, that your scrutineer is looking for. Each document doesn't have to be a 50-page report. In fact, scrutineers will often say what they really like seeing is when somebody has provided a field notebook with the logs from where they supervise some drilling, a hand-drawn cross-section, plus a computer CSM drawing. It shows the evolution. It shows you as a geologist in the field. It shows you as a geologist roughing something out, and then it shows your interpretation skills. Pictures tell 1,000 words. Well, obviously, you need to demonstrate your ability to write and to put over technical information. A great piece of field work is really going to stand you in good stead with your scrutineer. So, a little more from a point of view of hydrogeology. I have to be honest here and say the reason I am chartered with the GeolSoc is because somebody once said to me that hydrogeologists, particularly those working in contaminated land, as I was at the time, did not do enough geology to become chartered. And I thought, well, we'll see about that, shall we? But this is the point. You must ask yourself every single document, where is the geology? You obviously want to discuss the water, but you need to understand the water in the context of the geology. Why is the water flowing that way? What geological reason is there? What geological controls are there related to the water quality? Bring everything back to the geology. Explain how your work has evolved. Nobody got to the first day of their job and started to become a fantastic 3D groundwater modeler. Where have you gone from and where have you come to? It can be very, very tempting to people, particularly if they're doing it, say, 7, 9, 12 years down the line from getting their master's, getting their degree and things like that, to just bring out the most recent pieces of work. But actually, what people want to see is how you've evolved in your career. Where have you moved from your basic geological competencies, so the things that perhaps you were taught at university, how have you evolved that within your career? How does that fit into your CPD, where you took your career, where your interests lay, and now you've moved from being a field geologist to being somebody who writes very technical reports or does 3D modelling. Your best piece of work may focus on a very niche piece of hydrogeology, which encompasses a particularly complex modelling undertaken by a very few people, and that is great. But does it show you are a great geologist? Would a more modest piece of work, which is a good, solid piece of work, which details a strong conceptualization, not serve you as well, because you are going to be a chartered geologist? You're in the hydrogeology discipline, but you want to, again, bring everything back to the geology. Make sure you're including your own work. And this sounds like something that is an obvious statement because you sign off something to say all the work you have submitted is your own work. The further you get in through your career, the less work you do and the more work you review of others. Do not submit letters responding to other people's work unless it clearly demonstrates how your interpretation is correct, i.e. expert witness work. Saying why somebody else's work is perhaps deficient if you are, say, responding to a planning application and you're working on the side for the council or whatever else, unless you're putting through your own arguments as to why what they have said is not correct, and here's your interpretation of the geology and the hydrogeology, documents like that don't really stand in very good stead. Examine your CPD in detail. Make sure it tells the story. We all do CPD all day, every day. People sometimes find it difficult to identify what their CPD is, but we're all doing it all the time in our job. But don't overwhelm them. Make sure you're telling the story and that story reflects your progression. The way the GeolSoc CPD reporting is set up now is quite good, because you get to have your own overall strategy and then you get to subtask it and then you get to reflect back on it. But it also helps you, as already mentioned in David's talk, identify areas that you're perhaps a bit light on in terms of regulations, legislation, communications, things like that, and draw it all together. Again, you didn't start in your career knowing every single bit of regulation, and you're never going to know it. And sometimes you do get a new project across your desk where you do have to go and look at what the regulations or the legislations are in a different country, in a different area. Well, that's great. That shows your evolution. And make sure that story is matching the story that you're telling in your professional documents. And finally, the presentation. Or you've selected some documents that you think show how good a geologist you are, and they're probably generally going to be along the same line. Most of the applications that I've seen, people have either focused on dewatering, they've focused on contaminated land, they've focused on risk assessment. They've all been in the same vein generally. If that's the vein you've been operating in throughout your application, stick with it for the presentation. It can be very, very tempting for somebody to go, I haven't done enough 3D groundwater modelling in my document. So what I'll do is I'll talk about this 3D modelling project. Chances are the reason you haven't done that in your documents is because that might not be your speciality. Don't think you have to introduce a completely different topic. If your scrutineers think that actually you might be a bit light in an area that they want to see information about, they can ask you for some more documents. And it brings me on to my next point. When you get to your interview, what do you already know about your scrutineers? If they've asked you for some more documents, the chances are that's because that is what their specialisation is. When I was interviewed, I was asked about some geophysical logs that I'd mentioned in passing to help with the interpretation at a site. And I had to submit the logs. I pointed out they weren't my work. And when it came to it, shock horror, the person that was interviewing me was a geophysicist. So I already had that knowledge going in, which meant that the geophysics that I'd learned at my degree X number of years before, I could go back and refresh my mind as to what the key aspects with that were with regards to the hydrogeology. You go and have them look them up on LinkedIn. If they're on there, you're going to know what they're interested in. These are probably the areas that they're going to focus their questioning on. Know your documents inside out. It sounds like a daft one, but you perhaps put your application together over a number of years and picked various documents. Read round it, especially if it was perhaps a multi-phase site and you've picked one aspect of it. Look at the documents in terms of what questions your scrutineer might have. What is the aquifer you're talking about? How was it formed? Again, bringing it back to the geology. How does the geology underlie the hydrogeology, and how does that influence things that were going on at that site? What was the depositional environment of that sandstone which could have controlled those flows? Have a look at things like SPZs, who was the utilities companies, things like that. Just general questions that might come up that at the time when you wrote these documents, you probably could have answered them off the top of your head because this was the site that you've been working on for the past year. But actually, a couple of years further down the line, it's sort of gone into the back of your brain. Make sure you know what's new in terms of regulations and other situations. You need to understand not only your best practice and your guiding principles, what are you adhering to mostly in the type of work you do. You don't need to know them inside out, but you just need to know the highlights of them. If somebody asks you in your interview about the Water Framework Directive as a hydrogeologist and you can't explain what the Water Framework Directive is, it's not going to set a very good impression. Similarly, what's new? Is anything about to change with the Water Framework Directive? What AMP cycle are we in? what's happening recently with the EA? Have they announced a new drive on something? How's it all linking together? You need to be across things. It links back to your CPD. It's the sort of stuff that people are expecting you as a professional to understand what is going on in your industry. When it comes to the presentation, more speaking, less slides. Limit your slides, I'd say 5 at most. Choose a few key maps, drawings, graphs, outputs of models, things like that. Don't have that many words, not that many titles, maybe the odd one with an arrow on that draws attention to something. At this moment in time, we're still all doing the interviews over Zoom, and I can't see that changing anytime soon. So work with that, because you're going to have to speak more than perhaps you would at a normal face-to-face interview. So be prepared to talk. Your scrutineers want to get to know you, and they want to get to know your work. This is the equivalent of the oral exam to your written paper at your A-levels and your GCSEs. They are checking that you are who you say you are and can do what you can say you can do. So submit a good application, and you're already giving them confidence. They will then talk to you about what you want to talk about, guide that conversation. You don't need to know the answer to everything. There's no shame in saying you don't have experience of that, you're not aware of that. If you turn it around to say, but I am aware of this in another area. That's it, hopefully.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks very much. Very comprehensive. I think 2 talks there, 2 presentations, one on what it means to be a professional geologist, and then the second one on advice on the process of getting there. So I was just looking to see if there are any questions coming up, but none so far. If anyone's got any questions, please put them through or just join in. I'll kick off with one just to get things going. And perhaps this is more for David. And that is, there's been a lot of common themes coming through with both these presentations that we've heard of throughout these talks and get-togethers that we've had. And this business of helping the scrutineers, getting to know them, that sort of thing. And in the past, people have said that they've been overwhelmed with too much information, sometimes that isn't targeted towards their real application. And I wonder, David, do you think over the years you've seen the quality of the applications improve or not, or is it still the same old story?
Well, I don't know how my experience is common, but they're either utterly brilliant and model submissions that are a joy to go through, or they are so bad you really think that the candidate should perhaps get a job in retail, you know, the next tie counter or something. I mean, it is that appalling.
How do those slip through the net then?
Well, these are, well, from the sponsor's point of view, there is a failure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've seen there was one particular one where the sponsors were just literal one-liners into the, you know, when addressing the various chartership criteria and how it related to the candidate. And they were just literally one-liners, half a sentence. I'm at a loss to put it. I mean, okay, you get some sponsors that are going to be in senior positions, they haven't got a lot of time, and these things do take time. But if they really, I mean, if somebody came to me and I didn't have the time and said, could you be my sponsor? I'd have to say to them, I'm sorry, I don't have the time. I mean, it would have to be, I'd have to be quite open up front with them. So, you know, the weakness in the system, if you like, does come down to sort of individual conduct. But I would reinforce many times over what Lauren's been saying about sponsors are very, very important elements to it. They can sort of make or break a deal. But really, if they could just look at what the candidate submissions are and make an honest assessment that says, is this guy a runner or not? would be doing the candidate a lot more favours.
I suppose the sponsors are often the line managers who are trying to get the applicants to become chartered.
Yeah, there is that. Yeah, there is that element. I don't know whether it comes up, but I don't know whether there's stuff in the middle. I've yet to see it, and that's whether it's Rojet or CEng and CGeol. There are the working class or royalty. There's no middle class
in between. What about you, Lauren?
Yeah.
I don't know how many you've been through, but
I will use an experience recently where it was actually somebody that I was asked to scrutineer from, that hydrogeology, I don't know how many hydrogeologists there are on the call. I know there's a few looking at the names. Hydrogeology isn't a big world. We know each other generally, and the person I knew vaguely from other things. And the application wasn't particularly strong, but as David has said, the one-liners from the sponsor, who wasn't actually a sponsor who was chartered through the Geological Society, they were chartered through another society, was not helping the cause at all. And unfortunately, you can't see your sponsor statements before they put them in. They submit them separately from you, which is why I would say be very cautious about who you ask to be your sponsor and consider what their writing style is generally, because if they are a very scientific person who does a lot of very technical work that perhaps, their modelling or their calculations or their engineering stands by itself without needing a massive amount of cover information, then they perhaps aren't going to give you the detailed sponsor statement that perhaps a scrutineer would be looking to see from another peer.
Okay, I mean, it is actually difficult to find sponsors who could just come and talk about their experiences. We did put some feelers out about that. But I suppose everyone who's going through the application process and then becomes chartered will eventually go on to be sponsors themselves or mentors. So just giving the message out now is quite useful for future reference anyway.
I think the difficulty is that I don't think the role of the sponsor is very well defined, and I think people think that they are somebody who just writes a statement about them. You come to them at the end of the process. But once you've identified who your sponsors are going to be, which you probably should do fairly early in your application, they may actually be your mentor as well. So use them, lean on them. Don't be afraid to have regular meetings with them. From my point of view, the people I'm acting as sponsors for are sick of hearing from me about how their application is going, how they're progressing it. Have I got anything that I can look at? Things like that. Because I do think it's important, because it can feel like a bit of a difficult task to tie down how you're going to get from point A to point B with 7, 10, 12 years of experience and work to try and pick up and pick through, and what exactly it is that your scrutineer is going to be looking for.
I see there's a bit of bottom-up management going on here, so the applicant's managing their sponsor. Yeah. And in fact, the people who are attending today, I did ask people who registered to identify what stage they're at in the process, and most people did, thanks very much. And good few are at that stage where they're now gathering all their data and selecting their sponsors. And the rest are at the point where, more or less the rest are at the point where they're actually pulling the forms together before submitting the application. So there's still a sizable number in the audience today who will be either just selecting their sponsors or have just selected them. And all of them will be looking at how to manage them and get the best out of them.
And I think the difficulty is as well that sometimes, depending on the size of organisation you're working in, you might not have massive pool of people to pick from who are your technical discipline and work with you closely enough. And that is perhaps a reflection of the difficulties that people find in selecting their sponsors. I'm acting as a sponsor for people who don't work in my organisation.
Yeah, okay. I haven't actually got any other questions. I don't see, unless I'm missing something, I don't see any others coming up through on the chat thing. Is there anything else that both of you would like to say to finish off? Otherwise, I think we're 50 minutes down the line.
Hey, can I ask a question?
Hi, Harry, you pitching in with a question?
Yes, please. Yeah, Harry Sandbach. I work for Tarmac. I work as a geologist for them. I'm going to be submitting my application next year once I've just got everything ironed out. The question that I've got is, I'm going to be submitting from a quarrying reserves and resources point of view. So when it comes to the scrutineers that are assigned to me, are they going to be of a similar skill set? Because if it's something like hydrogeology, which I can read and understand reports, if I start getting asked in-depth questions, then I might be found wanting from that point of view. But if you ask me about, you know, calculations for reserves and resources, I can answer those quite comprehensively.
Anyone want to pick up on that? I thought the scrutineers were selected that reflect your own speciality.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
At least one is, but sometimes they try and get two. But you know, when you start talking about hydrogeology and quarrying and stuff, you know, it's displaying competence, submitting competence in your area of expertise. Well, if it's not hydrogeology, it is the quarrying element, and obviously the mineral resource calculations are a crucial factor. I don't see you're going to have a whole load of hydrogeologists stacked up against you at all.
Yeah, okay.
They do deliberately try and pick people who are in your technical area, so it won't just be a case of somebody who does mineral and resource and reserve estimates and things like that, because obviously you can do that from two sides. You can do it from the quarry operator side, or you can do it from the consultant side. They will probably try and pick you somebody from one of the other big mineral operators who is a chartered geologist, because your experience of what you would do as a resource reserve geologist for Tarmac is different to what somebody would do in a consulting environment. So they do try as much as possible to pair that up, because obviously if you are a consulting hydrogeologist and you've got somebody who is scrutineering, who is an academic hydrogeologist, and somebody else who's working for a water company, their experience of what they do as a hydrogeologist is vastly different to the experience of what you do. So they do try and tailor quite closely, and the scrutineers are asked whether they think, having a look at your application, whether they are appropriate to scrutineer for you or not. So everybody will turn around and say, you know, hands up, no, I don't feel confident in that area. So yeah, you will get somebody who knows what they're talking about.
Brilliant, thanks very much.
I think Nick's camera and microphone may not be working. So if there's no more questions, I think the slides will be added to the West Midlands Regional Group website. So yeah, is Nick back now?
Sorry, yeah, I seem to just drop out of the system then. Right.
Yeah, I'd just add to that if anybody on there is a hydrogeologist and does want to ask any further questions, they get off the call and think, oh, hold on, then, you know, I'm on LinkedIn, drop me a message, more than happy to help out where I can.
Yeah, thanks to Lauren and David, two excellent presentations. Our next one next month will be on experiences with filling in the forms, and after that we've got one on CPD, and that will sort of wrap us up for the year. So hopefully see you all next month sometime. Thanks very much.